Thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially Drew and Leanne and the folks at Wendell for presenting today. My name is Jason Haremza. I'm a senior planner at Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council. And again, we really appreciate Wendell for presenting on solar energy installation and how it relates to zoning and comprehensive plans. It's certainly a hot topic in our region. I'm just going to give a little bit logistical background here. So we will be taking attendance towards the end of the session, just to make sure everyone is still with us. And those folks that attended will be receiving an email with some form of documentation that they attended today's session, because I know a lot of you out there are doing this for to meet your training requirements for your municipal boards. So that may take a few days, up to a week. We're still working through the logistics on how exactly to do that, but don't worry, you will get documentation of your attendance. I will be monitoring the chat. I'll be helping out Drew and Leanne and monitoring the chat for questions and answers. So if you have questions, please do use the chat window, and we'll get to those at the end of the session today. Also, towards the end of the session, we'll be doing a short poll for Genesee Finger Lakes just to help us plan the local government workshop. As you all realize, we had to move this to a virtual format like everything else this past year. So we're trying to figure out at GFL how best to do training, whether we stick to a spring and a fall timeline, whether we do more continuous training like a session or two every month throughout the year, what time of day is best, those kinds of questions. So that'll be coming up at the end. And then finally, I know we have a good crowd today, but you know, take a look at the rest of the sessions over the next coming weeks for our local government workshop this spring. And please do sign up if any of those are of interest to any of you. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters today. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Jason. Leanne, we can go to the overview. Jason gave a pretty good overview of what we're trying to do today. I'm not going to read from the slides. I know that's the most boring thing, but basically we're looking at the interrelationship between comprehensive plan, zoning, and large solar projects. And, you know, you could also relate, although we're focusing on solar here, this could relate to wind projects also. We are concentrating on solar, but you could say a lot of the same things about large wind projects proposed in your community too. It's the interrelationship between comprehensive plans and solar laws is very interesting from the fact that I related to when Walmart supercenters were proposing stores in small communities throughout New York State. It all of a sudden got communities thinking about comprehensive planning because these large projects were not anticipated in their community, and they started thinking about things. Well, I think solar projects are the same way. These large scale projects are making communities rethink about what their plans are for their community and how these projects could have impact them or how they should control them. So that's kind of an overview of what we're doing here. Next, the presentation outline, we're going to talk a little bit about the presenters. I'll introduce Leanne in a minute. Our experiences, we have a lot of different experiences with these types of projects. We're going to talk about the types of solar, which you're all probably very, very well aware of. You can't pick up a newspaper without you know, learning about solar projects and green energy projects. We're going to talk about the comprehensive plan in general and how it relates to solar. Then we're going to talk about the regulations of how municipalities regulate them. We'll talk a little bit about the 94C project process, and then we'll kind of summarize it. We have some questions throughout for that. So with that, let's get to the presenter. I have my picture up here, and lovely Leanne doesn't get to have her picture up here. But again, I'm Drew Riley. I'm with Wendell. I've been with Wendell about 31 years. I'm an environmental engineer and a planner. Most of my work is representing municipalities. Over the last 35 plus years, I've represented dozens of municipalities. My wife says my one claim to fame is that she stopped counting at 3,000 planning board and town board meetings. So I've attended a lot of those meetings. I've completed numerous comprehensive plans, that number is probably over 50 now. I've created solar laws, and I've helped with these types of projects. One thing I have to stress here, Leanne and I are not attorneys. We are not giving legal advice. We're giving you our experiences with laws, comprehensive plans, and these types of projects. I'll talk a little bit about Leanne here. Leanne is a lead certified planner here at Wendell. She's been here, she has 18 years of experience. And I think one of the things she's helping me with is that she's very experienced when it comes to working on comprehensive plans, agricultural protection plans, parks master plans, things like that, which are very relevant to planning the future of your community. So that's a little bit about me and Leanne. And Leanne, thank you for joining. She wasn't in the outline of the presentation, but Leanne is helping me today because I've done a couple of these now, and I hate it when you have to sit there and talk for an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes. I'll have someone else look at it instead of me for an hour and 10 minutes. Next slide is a little bit about our experiences. I also just want to mention a little about Wendell first. It's not on the slide, but Wendell is a full service design company. We have civil engineers, architects, all types of engineers, planners, landscape architects, energy, which I think is very important. We have an energy group that does green energy projects. They understand them. So we understand both sides of these types of projects. We have sustainability experts, and we have close to 300 people now and over 10 offices throughout much of the country. Our experience of late, we've dealt with large non-Article 10 projects, anywhere from 10 to 100 plus acre projects, most of these being representing communities. We've also worked on Article 10. I've been involved in Article 10 projects for the last 5 years. Of course, they are mostly converting over to the 94C process, which we're going to talk about later. We've worked on dozens of solar laws and helped with municipal attorneys and others working with the towns and communities to create these solar laws. We're also in the process of updating comprehensive plans because, again, like I said, and we're going to talk about that in today's presentation, is that communities are now refocusing on their comp plans of how these projects are impacting them. We're also experiencing processing these types of projects. We've seen them actually go through planning board, ZBA, town board approvals, et cetera, and seen them constructed and seen what has happened and some of the issues that have risen even during construction and after construction of these projects. So we have kind of the full gamut of experiences with these types of projects. So we always like to start, this is the first time I'm going to turn it over to Leanne for a little bit. We always like to start a little bit about some questions. It helps us during our presentation on who's on the line. So Leanne, if you want to run a couple of the polling questions, if you're at your computers, please answer some of our questions here.
Thank you, Drew, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So we do have a couple of polls. I'm going to put them up on the screen, and you can just multiple choice click it. Should be pretty straightforward. Hey, here's the first question. What is your role within your community? You guys are good at this. So we're at about 85% of people have voted. We'll give it another couple seconds. Should be a pretty easy one. Okay, I'm going to show the results now.
Oh.
Everybody see that? There's our results. We have 36% planning board members, ZBA, other board members, code officials, and then we have others. Okay, so that's good. That helps us really understand who we're talking to. So then I've got a couple more polls. As I get to it, that's number one. Question is, do you have a solar law and how old is it? So this is kind of a two-part question, but every answer has the opportunity for two questions, for two answers, I'm sorry. Just a quick reminder, while you guys are doing this, videos are on for many people, and I do have everyone in the meeting muted. So if something does come up, you have to unmute yourself. But yeah, just a reminder, videos are on and we are recording. So we're at 35 of 48 people. Get a couple more people. All right, I'm going to end the polling now and share the results. So it looks like most of you do not have a solar law, or you have one that is pretty recent, 3 years or less. So this is interesting. So maybe some of those who do have a solar law in place towards the end can offer some comments in the chat to really, you know, give people some advice. All right, next one. Do you have a comprehensive plan and how old is it? So similar to the solar question.
I like this one because a lot of times I ask communities to see their comprehensive plans and it takes them a couple days to find it, and they pull it out and say, yep, here it is. And I ask them how long it's been since they've actually looked at the comprehensive plan.
So if you could let me know if the background noise gets to be too much here in the office. All right, ending polling. Less than 5 years old. That's interesting. So we've got a pretty even spread here. That's good.
Good.
All right. And the last one for this section is, I think this is the last one, right, Drew?
Hopefully.
Do you have a solar project currently before your community, or have you approved one?
Excellent.
All right, we ready?
Yep.
There's our results.
So at least 50% of them have dealt with solar projects. So, and the other 50% may in the near future deal with them. And we're going to talk about how you can plan for that and see if they're coming to your community. Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's go back to the slides.
Everyone.
Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about solar. First of all, we tend to describe them as kind of 4 different types of solar projects. I think the state's model law talks about 3 types of solar. We really break them into 4 categories, and we'll explain why. The first ones are, of course, your rooftop, your building mounted and building integrated, which are accessory uses to a structure. Most communities regulate these through a building permit process. Some have gone as far, some of these may require site plan, but most of them are building permit. Then you have ground mounted backyard units, still considered accessory structures. These are ones, there's a lot of people that can't put solar on their building. They may want to put them in their backyards. Again, communities mostly treat these and their laws under as building permits or building permits plus site plan approval sometimes. And again, these are limited. You can't put if I have a house, I can't put a big solar array in my backyard that generates more power than what I typically use at my home. That's how NYSERDA regulates them too under the New York Sun program. So these are standard ones, and we're not going to be talking too much about these types of projects in today's presentation, but the next 2 levels, and I broke it into 2 levels, is you have ground mounted, which are primary use. Someone wants to rent someone's property to put, and we tend to see a lot of them, 5 megawatt or less projects, 5 megawatt, 4 megawatt, 3 megawatt projects, etc., on a piece of property. These are a primary use, and these are going to be regulated under your law, and you may have different regulations for them, but we break these into a certain size. And again, we regulate zoning based upon impacts to land. So it's not based upon megawatts. It says up to a certain size. So this could be a certain size unit, and we'll talk about that a little later. And then you have the ones that don't meet that criteria that are larger, even larger than that. We call those, you can call them industrial scale or however you want to call them. They can include Article 10 or 94C projects, but they can also include non-94C projects. So again, we'll talk about why we see them basically as 4 different types of projects, and we're going to focus on the bottom 2. So next slide is, so big picture wise, and just taking a step back here, is that you realize anything less than 25 megawatts or has not converted, you could have a 20 megawatt project that converted over 94C. Then if it's less than those parameters, you know that you can regulate them. Local zoning basically allows you to regulate these. They're not governed by the state of New York. If you are over 25 megawatts, or they've converted to 94C, which you'll find out about your projects, then the project does not require local approvals, but it's processed through ORES, which is a new agency formed in the state of New York, basically to regulate these. And we'll be talking about the 94C process. But the one thing we have to know here under the first one, which we're going to spend a little time on, is that if it's under 25 megawatts and you're regulating it, the gist of this presentation is the fact that
Drew, I think we lost you. Is anyone else? Give me a thumbs up if Drew is frozen. All right, Drew, you're frozen. Bear with us for one moment while we try to get Drew back online.
In the meantime, this is Jason from Genesee Finger Lakes. One more note on logistics, since the first poll, Leanne asked about audience, and we had about 30% other. Those may be planning staff, and I just wanted to let those folks know, if you are here for AICP credits, we have submitted this, and so AICP CM credits are pending for professional planners. And I will let folks know when those are approved. So thank you.
I will be right back, everybody. I apologize. I have to check, see if Drew is able to get back online. I'll be right back.
While Leanne and Drew are dealing with our technical issues, and I appreciate everyone's patience on that, I just wanted to, I guess, share a little bit of my experiences with solar projects. Prior to returning to the Regional Planning Council, I worked for a rural town in Tompkins County, and we actually had, while I was there, we had an application for a backyard ground-mounted solar installation, which one of Drew's recent slides sort of highlighted as one of the options. And I'm hoping he'll get to the, you know, again, how to regulate these types of installations. But in the town I worked for, the setbacks for an installation like that had to meet the principal use as opposed to an accessory use, which I found a little surprising. So if you wanted to install a ground-mounted solar installation in your backyard, it wasn't like building a shed or a pool or a garage like an accessory use. It was more like building a house on your property. And for some smaller parcels, that severely limited the ability to install these sorts of things. So That may be something you want to consider if your community, how much you want to encourage those types of installations, or make it more difficult, and that's for your community to decide. But just be aware of some of those unintended consequences of putting in those regulations. So are we back? All right.
You want to hear the ironic thing?
What's that?
My power went out in the room. I need some solar panels. That's pretty funny, isn't it?
And you guys aren't even, you're not out in the middle of nowhere. You're in Amherst, right?
Well, it was in the one room the power went out. Don't know why in the one room. Obviously it's on everywhere else, but it's always nice when the screen goes dead and nothing happens. So.
There you go. All right.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for filling in there for Jason. Okay.
No problem.
So, I don't know where you left off, but
well, I was just sharing my experience working for a rural town in Tompkins County, and one of the bullet points on your recent slide talked about sort of backyard ground-mounted installations, and I ran across an issue with the setbacks. And the town I worked for imposed setbacks for the principal use for those types of things, as opposed to treating it as an accessory use, right, which really put up some hurdles for some smaller parcels in the town for folks to be able to install those. So I was just talking about some of those unintended consequences.
Yep. Yeah, we saw that in communities 5-7 years ago, that most communities didn't have a separate solar law. So when they got these small backyard units, they didn't know how to treat them. Most of them treated like a garage or whatever. But okay, let's get back to the next slide is about larger scale units. And that's that category, that third category I talked about, where they can be 5 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres, 40 acres. You determine, and that's why I tell my communities is, based upon you looking at your community. Most communities, you get a 10-acre project, a 20-acre project, a 50-acre project. It is a very large project in the community. So you can set a parameter. And again, it's not based upon the power usage or the power generation or whatever. It's an acreage thing. So in your community, if something over 20 acres is going to be a big impact to your community, then I would set this larger scale at 20 acres. And then you're going to regulate that type of solar, and you're going to determine where it's allowed. And again, we're going to talk about how you would determine where it's allowed is basically look at your comp plan. Are there other things that you should consider in there? You're also going to put together a process for approval. Like any zoning code, you're going to talk about site plan special use permits. You're going to limit the size, like I talked about, based upon your plan. What are the size of units that could impact you? You're going to do the standard zoning stuff. You're going to set bulk zoning requirements, and you're going to have other technical requirements that you typically have in your code. And again, I'm talking here about your zoning regulations, but you're going to see how it relates to comprehensive plan. So we have these large scale projects. And by the way, the last thing I put on here is about host community agreements. And we can talk about that later, but you can have host community agreements for these scale projects if you want them. Everybody talks about host community agreements being for Article 10 or 94C projects, but you can have a host community agreement requirement in your community for these scale projects. Again, this is an agreement you have with the developer to pay funds, do projects for the community, etc. They are an interesting tool that should be looked at. So anyway, so those are larger scale. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about industrial scale. So once you set a level of, say that's 40 acres or whatever that number is, you're going to say anything above that level, we're going to label what we call an industrial scale, or whatever you want to call it in your definition sections of your code, but you can call it industrial scale. And again, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to determine where you would allow industrial scale. I've had some communities say they would only allow them in industrial districts. Some of them allow them in agricultural districts, but then have, again, agricultural zoning districts we're talking about, but then they're going to have restrictions. So again, you're going to have the process for approvals, what's required for approval of such a project. These are very big projects, so you're going to have other technical requirements and other bulk requirements are going to be different than the one we talked about before. These are very big projects that can have a tremendous impact on the community. Just checking my notes now that I'm not at my own computer, it becomes a little difficult here. These projects include not only non-Article 94C projects, but also include projects that may not meet that. So, and people ask me, well, why would you do that, Mr. Riley? Why would you put, why don't we have a separate category for 94C? Well, because you should group those all together, because whether it's 50 acres, 100 acres, 200 acres, or thousands of acres, they are big projects that impact your community. To have separate regulations for 94C is kind of doesn't make sense, because you'll find out later they don't have to meet local zoning, they only have to consider your laws. So we try to say that these larger scale projects are all treated the same, and then we allow them to be processed similarly, and that they'll consider them, and I don't know if I'm explaining that correctly, but they'll consider them in the 94C regulations, which we'll talk about. So with that all said, I kind of led up to these different, I realize I've done presentations on solar laws, but I want Leanne to talk a little bit about comprehensive plans. And let's talk about the common issues. These are the things that are going to go into your laws. You're going to talk about setbacks, you're going to talk about screening and aesthetics, community character, historic components. We talked about tree removal, lot coverage, impacts agricultural, important environmental features. Well, I won't go through this whole list, but this is a great introduction to what Leanne's going to talk about, because look at this list and tell me, these are all things that you would consider in your comprehensive plan. These are all things that you talk about in your comprehensive plan. So why would you not look at your comprehensive plan when you're setting up these laws and talking about these impacts? So I'm going to let Leanne talk a little bit about comprehensive plans, so I can reorganize myself here as I ran to a different room here. So I'll let Leanne talk a little bit about comprehensive plans.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's talk about comprehensive plans. Many of you said that you had them, that they were fairly recent, but let's just kind of talk about the basics here. What is a comprehensive plan first? It's just really an organized set of materials and information in your community to really identify goals and objectives and develop a long-term growth plan. So when you're looking at your comprehensive plan, you want to change it. You want to reevaluate your comprehensive plan. I think I saw somebody say in the chat that their comprehensive plan was from 1965. So those are, you want to update these plans, right? Technologies change, communities change, demographics change. And one of the big things, as Drew was talking about, that we are seeing right now is, of course, solar projects. And a lot of comprehensive plans and zoning laws do not address solar projects. So why prepare a comprehensive plan or even update it, for that matter? So we're talking about, creating a new one, or we're talking about updating it. Establishing a community vision that is true to the times. What are you looking at today? Are you seeing more solar projects or wind farms or things of that sort? Or like I said, has your demographics greatly changed? You really want to really understand your strengths and your weaknesses, understand the natural resources in your community, and ultimately provide direction for governmental agencies. Now, what does your comprehensive plan do for you? Well, it makes it easier to apply for grants. When you're applying for a grant, especially from the state level, they want to see that your community has planned. They want to see that you have something in place. And also, your zoning has to be in compliance with your comprehensive plan. So those are some items that you really need to consider in terms of having your comprehensive plan up to date. Again, here we go. I guess I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, but why is this important? It's a smart growth legislation coming from New York State. County and regional plans have been completed. There's quite a few regional plans that we now have that really set guidelines for what counties and communities how they should, I guess, respond to the current trends within the region. And of course, again, solar, large-scale projects are being proposed all throughout New York State. We're seeing this both as a representative from the private side as well as a representative from the public side. So really the goals, the components of this plan, you know, establishing where you want to be, where are you now, how do you get there, and building what we call the cookbook to success, and then creating a strategy for review. Like I said, you want to keep updating your plan, and in your comprehensive plan, set parameters for that. We want to evaluate every 5 years. We want to evaluate every year. It depends on really the size of your community and the whole scale, scope and scale of your comprehensive plan. So we can talk about this real quick. Where are you now? Where are you going? This is your evaluation of what your community looks like now, right? What has changed in these areas? New solar, you're seeing other, you know, people are maybe currently requesting more and more certain zoning changes. Maybe there's more desire for multifamily development. So a lot of different things that could have changed in your community. So one of the examples that we're seeing now is this references the Erie County Ag Protection Plan. And what they did is they took an assessment in their mapping of where the major transmission lines are and the electrical transmission lines are. So there is a transmission line that runs right along this path here and over here. If you can see, hopefully you can see my little arrow. If not, I apologize, but and they created buffers around it and really identifying these are areas that solar companies may want to locate because they're so close to the major transmission lines. And then what they did is they evaluated this against valuable agricultural soils. So you're starting to see that some of these properties that would be considered valuable to solar companies, they're also seen as valuable in the ag community. So this is where you start to see a lot of conflicts come into play, and you want a plan that helps the decision makers head towards the right decision for your community. So again, where are you now and where are you going? Again, what has happened in your community, the surrounding areas, your regional plans. Where do you want to be? You set your goals, your objectives. Maybe you'll develop a vision statement, but really this is your framework or your guiding light for your community as you move forward. And when you're looking at an update, you know, what major revisions are needed? Is it a complete redo to the plan, or are there just some certain sections that need to be added or changed? And with regards to solar, you really want to make sure that there is some language in there that does reflect potential large-scale solar projects. So how do we get there? Data analysis. Developing findings from the inventory of existing conditions. You want to look at any needed changes in your zoning. This is really where you're doing a solid data analysis right up front. You may you'll talk to the public. You'll start to really gather what is happening in your community. And based on, you know, the findings and the analysis, you'll develop goals and objectives. You'll look at any changes that need to happen and any recommendations. And when it comes to solar, what you really want to do is get language in there that talks about the solar and what your community's wishes are with regards to it, and talks about whether or not you need to update any zoning, talk about setbacks, really start to make some recommendations within your comprehensive plan. And then ultimately we're seeing communities develop a separate solar law. One of the recommendations within the comprehensive plan may state that develop a solar law within the next however many years to help give the community some guidance as far as how they want to handle large and small scale solar. Drew, I think I'm ready to hand this off to Drew. So thank you again. I'll be on in another minute or two with some more polling questions for you all.
The musical chairs. So I'm going to step back a little before I work on this slide and just talk a little bit about what Leanne had to say based upon, you know, your original answers to the questions. About 50% of you have comprehensive plans, and about 50+% and 40% do not have comprehensive plans. So obviously for those communities that do not have comprehensive plans, this would be a bigger lift to try to look at your community and anticipate what's going to happen in the future. For the communities that have comprehensive plans, we're working on at least a half dozen right now. They're simple updates. As Leanne explained, you have three basic components of any comprehensive plan. I'm sure all your comprehensive plans look different, but they have three basic components. The components are existing conditions. You have to understand what's happening in your community. So take your existing comprehensive plan and say, okay, what has changed over the last 5 years or since that when you did it? Has something changed? Do you have solar projects being proposed? Put them on a map, show them where they're proposed. Put that information about where the transmission lines and where there could be solar projects in the future. By the way, as an aside, we have some county representatives on the call. Other counties are helping their local communities, and they can provide great information to help you identify where you have transmission lines, even go as far as where that there's capacities in those transmission lines and capacities in the substations. You realize that's what the solar developers are doing. They're basically going to maps, finding out where the transmission lines are, where their capacities in those transmission lines and the substations, and then they're looking for available land to potentially lease for that project. So they're doing that. You should be doing the same thing, preparing, working with the county. Hopefully the county can help you generate that data and understand where these projects could be coming within your community. So again, that existing condition section, update it, get that information from the county. If the county has I know many of the counties do, Genesee County, have an agricultural plan, get that agricultural data, get it incorporated in your plan. All the regions have sustainability plans, pull that information in from those sustainability grants and plans, bring that all together. So update your plan, or that could even help you create a new plan by taking all those existing information and begin to develop that. If you're an agricultural community, make sure you get all that data. So Leanne said this, the next component of a comprehensive plan, which is the most important part, is the vision of your community. So if you have an existing comprehensive plan, I'm sure you have vision in there about preserving character of your community or helping agricultural things like that. We'll anticipate in the vision part of it, the goals and objectives, or however you relay those. How is that? How do you want to accommodate? Do you want to accommodate green energy? How is that going to be accommodated in? But also understand that if you're getting these projects, how is that changing the vision of your community? Does it change the vision of the community? Is there something else that you have to consider in that vision? So take a look at that vision. And then, as Leanne said, the last component of any comprehensive plan, I always tell people, a comprehensive plan can be adopted by local law, but all a comprehensive plan does is set the framework for you to do actions in the future. First of all, zoning has to be in accordance with a comprehensive plan. So if you amend your zoning and stuff, it has to be in accordance with a comprehensive plan. But a comprehensive plan can also be used to, to make changes in your community. So say you have one of those communities that you're getting one of these large 94C projects. I know communities that are getting 2,000-acre solar projects within their community, 3,000-acre solar projects within their community. Don't you think that's going to impact, whether it's an existing comprehensive plan, the future of the community? So do you need to adjust your comprehensive plan and say, hey, how is this 3,000-acre project going to impact your community, and how do you need to change things? I mean, you may or may not be able to control that as much as you can if you get one of those larger projects, and we're going to talk about 94C, but that's what you need to do. So again, I want to summarize what Leanne had done. She explained what a comprehensive plan is, and then I'm just saying, okay, doesn't that make sense that whether you have one, to update it, or to, if you don't have one, at least put something together. You do realize that comprehensive plans can be what you want them to be. I've seen good comprehensive plans that are 10, 15 pages long. I've seen comprehensive plans that are volumes and thousands of pages. There is no state criteria that says you have to do it. A comprehensive plan is your idea of putting your reasoning behind the future of your community. Get people involved in your community, get the boards involved, and work on your comprehensive plan. Everybody fears it because they think it's such a huge task, but it's really not. Sometimes it can be done very simply, especially when it comes to these types of projects, how you want to see the future happen in your community. So back to this slide. So a summary of what we've talked about today. to what we talked about so far is that we have established that solar projects can be very large. They can be, and a large project for a community could be a 50-acre solar project. You realize that could have a big impact on your community. Or obviously a 1,000-acre one or more can have a huge impact on your community. These things will impact your community assets and the long-term consequences of your community. You build a project like that in your community that you have not anticipated, it's going to have long-term implications. I'm going to step aside here because I want to talk about one of those things. We do a lot of agricultural protection plans, and I've had a lot of conversations with different agricultural communities and whatever. If you go to put 2,000 acres of solar on agricultural lands in your community, which we're seeing a lot of them going on, these large scale projects going on agricultural lands, it has impacts beyond just those 2,000 acres of land. You all know, if you understand agricultural, if I'm taking out 200 acres of land that someone is leasing, that farmer is leasing, you take that 200 acres of land out of being leased by that farmer may not have enough land to lease anymore to make his farm economical and whatever, and he may lose other leases and whatever. So it could have a compound effect beyond the 2,000 acres that you've taken out. It could result in other acreage being taken out of farming, and then that could affect other businesses in your community. So it could have a very long-term effect on your community. So agriculture is a big one you're going to have to look at in your community if these projects are being proposed on agricultural lands. So summary, comprehensive plans are your community's planning tool. They're your basic planning tool. It can be what you want it to be. You need a good description of what's happening in your community, updating that. You need to set vision, and you need to have recommendations. One of the recommendations that's going to come out of it is, how do I set up my solar law, which we're going to talk about in a second. So, so comprehensive plans can help a community react to these major changes, and it sets your basis for reasoning for zoning. So let's get to the solar law. Let's talk a little bit about solar laws. This presentation is not about, I did one last month on the whole presentation, or hour plus, I'm just talking about how to develop a solar law. But I just want to talk about the basics of a solar law, because some of you do not have a solar law, and basically say this is how you would put this together. First of all, I would highly recommend, it's not a bad start. New York State, NYSERDA, if you go to their website, they have a model law, a law that pretty much set up that you can just fill in the blanks if you want, but you also can amend. It is a good starting point for a solar law. It lays out all the things that you could think about in a solar law, but then you can build upon that. So a typical solar law has an intent section. One of the things I would recommend you do in your intent section is refer to your comprehensive plan, or your comprehensive plan that you're developing or you're updating. Refer to it. Why are you regulating solar? What is the intent of what you're trying to accomplish by having this solar law? So again, it works well with your comprehensive plan. You need to define it. We talked about early on about, I believe that there are 4 types of solar projects. You need to define them for your community, especially the difference between the 3rd and the 4th tier. What is a big impact to your community? Is the tier 3 project a 30 acre or larger, or 30 acres or less, or is it 40 acres or less, or is it 10 acres or less? You define it how you want based upon your analysis of your community. So definitions are important. Then the other big thing that's going to come out of your comprehensive plan is, like any zoning law, you're going to define where they are allowed in your community, right? You're going to say these tier 1 and tier 2 projects probably are allowed in every district in your community. Anybody can have a backyard or accessory solar project. You could put that in your law, but obviously the tier 3 and tier 4 ones, it's going to take a lot of work and decisions. Where are you logically allowing Article 3, tier 3 projects, and where would you allow tier 4 projects? I would, and we're going to talk about this later, I would not recommend you just basically, and I've seen some people say this, that we will not allow tier 4 projects, and we will not allow these large scale projects in our community. The problem with that is, and under the new 94C regulations, is that there'll be nothing in your law to give direction to that developer if you write it that way. So I would recommend you have something at least in your law, even though you may be very restrictive, but have something about those larger projects in your law. You're going to have bulk zoning requirements. Typically, any zoning code has bulk zoning, setbacks, things like that. You're going to have submittable materials. What is important to your community? What do you want them? And I've worked with a lot of different developers on solar projects. And if you tell them this is the information you need, your community needs, they will submit it. So list those things in your law that are important for you to see in your applications, you as planning board members or other people that are reviewing these projects. Again, I think the most important part, which you can build off in the model law, is those other requirements that you're going to have for solar. What is unique about your community? I'll give an example. I work with one community that, I can give lots of examples, but one community has a lot of orchards in their community, and they're very fearful of losing orchards because orchards are more difficult to recover. The theory of solar projects is that, well, you build a solar project on an agricultural land, you preserve that soils, and 20 to 25 years from now, you will have that land to be converted back to agricultural. Well, with orchards, that would be a little more difficult to convert it back to orchard, especially if you spent years creating an orchard that takes a long time to develop. So you may have some specific requirements for your community. One of the communities I work with has the escarpment, one of the escarpments running through their community. Obviously, they're going to have regulations in there about how they would deal with solar or not allow solar in those escarpment areas of your community. So again, make it unique to your community. The New York State model law does not talk about uniqueness. It talks about it has to apply to all communities. So it's a generic giving you direction on your solar law. And then you would include the other required sections of your law. So next slide and we'll talk. Okay. As I said, the unique aspects of your community and your plan, those different types of categories, the restrictions on where you would allow solar, the approval processes. Remember, a lot of communities for these larger projects, say a 5-acre project or whatever, require a special use permit process. Well, it's nice to have a special use permit process, but I tell people under special use permits, you should put reasoning. Remember, anytime you have a special use permit, what are the criteria you're using to determine why you would grant a special use permit or not? Some towns have even separate sections for each, which you would do in your solar law, explaining here are the criteria, here are the impacts of things on what we will consider in issuing that special use permit. By the way, in this, some communities have incentive zoning laws or pre-permitted laws and whatever. There are very creative laws out there for regulating solar. I won't get in those today, but you'll have a process within your community. Almost every community I've worked with that is an agricultural community has some restrictions on the types of soils that they're impacting. When I say types of soils, some of you on the line understand there are prime agricultural soils. Ag markets will tell you they want to try to have these projects avoid prime agricultural soils. Well, you can have limitations in your zoning code about that. I've seen some communities say you cannot put these certain types of projects on prime agricultural soils. Some limit the amount of, they say, well, if the parcel has more than 50% prime agricultural soils, you can't develop that parcel. So there's different ways of protecting agricultural. We can't always, Ag Markets does a great job, but we can't always just depend on Ag Markets for certain criteria. I found out the hard way that there are exceptions in the law. I won't give a specific example, is that we had Ag Markets very concerned about a project impacting prime agricultural lands in a community, but then we got a letter from the state of New York saying that basically they were exempt because of the time period of when they applied for their solar project, that they did not have to meet the Ag Markets requirements that were being listed. So I would not always just count on Ag Markets. I would use them as a source. But again, you have the powers of local zoning for things that are under the 94C, not under the 94C process. You control it. So put some things in there about how you want to protect your agricultural land and your agricultural soils. Again, the next bullet is the protection of unique features. You know the unique features of your community, whether they be orchards, whether they be escarpments, whether they be other things within your community. Historic areas of your community, you're trying to preserve the historic character of those communities. In your laws, you're going to have bonds and insurances. Please work with your legal staff and whatever. Those are very standard components of a solar law. You want to make sure that you're protected, and that one of the big issues of solar projects is, and that's the theory in your comprehensive planning, is that you're planning 20 years out that these large solar projects may be decommissioned and go away 20, 25, 30 years from now. Well, what is your plan when those solar projects leave? Do you have a different plan for those areas of your community? When I did planning for communities that have landfills and whatever, you know, they have an end use plan. Well, what are they going to do with that area of that community after the landfill goes out of business? Well, theoretically, solar projects have a lifespan and they may go away. And you want to make sure that you're considering that. And then you have the bonds. The bonds are protect you from the fact that if that solar project goes away, if they're bankrupt, that you have a bond you can collect on to remove the solar panels and restore that property to the previous conditions that it was in. Ag and Markets has some very good rules and regulations for restoring property back for agricultural purposes. The one I have on here is about host community agreements. I think they're very powerful tools. If you're getting a large scale solar project, whether it's 15 megawatts, whether it's large scale or bigger than that, I think a host community agreement is a great thing, because you can use the host community agreement, say this, you know that this project is you can't stop it and it's going to impact, say, some form of agriculture in your community. You could use the host community agreement monies to do things to help the farmers. Is there a way we can help the farmer keep in business? You can use that monies in many different ways. You can address future impacts, or you can use it to address current impacts in your community. What I do also recommend, and anytime you create a solar law, and please, again, we're not attorneys, get good legal advice in creating them. Stay within the New York State implementing regulations. You realize you're given the power of zoning, but the state also puts some boundaries on. Home rule is home rule, but there are some boundaries what you can do. There are things that you should be very careful about putting in your zoning law. Solar is a zoning law that the implementing regulations give you certain things that you can do. Don't go outside of what the New York State allows. We have a lot of flexibility, but there's certain things that you can't go outside of in those implementing regulations. So please get good legal advice on that when creating a law. Next slide. So we've skirted the issues to this point. Where are we time check wise? We're at 12:26. We want to finish up in the next 10-15 minutes to maybe try to answer some questions. And that's the hard part about doing these Zoom ones, is that I like to see people and understand their concerns. So let's talk about Article 10, or I call the Tier 4, some of the Tier 4 projects. First of all, Article 10 has kind of gone by the wayside. That was the article used to process these large scale projects in the past. And some of you may be familiar, a lot of wind projects, not many of them got approved, but a lot of them went through the Article 10 process. They are now being converted over to the 94C process. You can continue under the Article 10 if you're far enough along in your process. And if you're a community that has dealt with Article 10, you know all about this. For those of you who haven't dealt with Article 10, you don't have to worry about it because it's passé. You're now moving on to 94C. Next slide. The 94C process, it's here. The legislation was passed last year, and the new rules are in place. So the 94C rules are in place. The Office of Renewable Energy Siting, ORES, I always have to pronounce that correctly, is in place, and they have created this process for these projects to go through now. Again, these are for projects that are 25 megawatts or more in size. You'll know if you have one in your community. The interesting part about the 94C regulations, and that what got most communities concerned, was the fact that there are mandated timeframes for the approval process. Technically, when they make an application to the state of New York, if they make a complete application within 1 year, they will have approval, or it will be a default approval. So the next bullet is an important bullet, is that even though you have a 94C project in your community being proposed or may be proposed in the future, they still have to consider your local zoning in their application. So for those communities I'm working with for 94C, those developers are coming to your community. They're doing as much as they can to try to meet your local zoning, or asking you maybe to do some minor amendments to it, because they do not want to make application to the state of New York with the idea that they're not meeting the local zoning. Our understanding, and no one can say they're an expert on 94C because no one has gone through the process. It's a new process, but my understanding, and you can get input from other people, you can get input from an NYSERDA, other attorneys who have reviewed this, but my understanding is that, you know, they really do want to try to meet your local zoning. They do not want to go through the adjudicatory process with the state of New York to prove why your laws are unreasonable or not. And we believe strongly, if your laws are, your zoning laws, solar laws, are based on a comprehensive plan, a well thought out comprehensive plan, and your zoning law is well thought out, the reasoning behind it, hopefully, even if you get into an adversarial position on this project, that the state will consider that your laws are not unreasonable and overly burdensome. They're articulate and well formatted. So that's one of the reasons we're doing this presentation today. These are not only for the projects that you regulate and you know that you can regulate, but that under 94C, you can have some influence over that project. And so far, we've seen some influence on the projects I'm working for. The developers are sitting and meeting with the communities and saying, hey, we're trying to meet your local zoning. We're trying to do the best we can to meet those regulations and those things that you've pointed out in your local law. So, and again, I've heard it from state officials and whatever, is that they recommend you have an up-to-date comprehensive plan that addresses green energy and solar laws and reflecting the plan. We even had, and I'll applaud Erie County. Erie County provided some, they put money where their mouth is. They said to the communities, they provided local funding to help some of these communities to update their comprehensive plans to address these large scale projects, so that then they could have a well-supported zoning ordinance in place to support those laws that they're putting in place. So what's the next slide? Okay, we're going to have some, where are we from a time standpoint? We're actually in pretty good shape. We're a little ahead of schedule, so I will let Leanne do some closing questions, and based on those closing questions, we may have some additional things, or we'll look through, I'll have Jason come on and say if there's some things in the chat box that we want to address, but we wanted to leave enough time to answer questions. So let's first find out a little bit, did we present correctly here, and do we understand your issues?
Hey, everybody, let's get these polls going. Question number 5. Does your comprehensive plan currently address solar? Should be up here. Yeah, I'll give you a couple more seconds. We'll go up to 30. Majority of people said no, 56%. That's good. Thumbs up. Can you guys see the poll results when I put them on the screen? Give me a thumbs up if you can see them. I'm seeing nodding. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Next question. Is your solar law in accordance with your comprehensive plan? Of course, if you answered no, you don't have a solar law. Don't know. All right. About 5 more seconds. Okay. Most of you, majority, either don't know or the answer is a solid no. So that's something where you definitely want to consider looking at your comprehensive plan to see if it does address solar, and if it does not, then you will want to take a look at doing an update. Okay. Question 7. Can your comprehensive plan help you plan for the future if a large-scale solar project is proposed in your community? Similar to the last question, but a little bit more specific. Okay, I'll go about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close that poll. Interesting spread kind of across the board, relatively even between the yeses and the don't knows, you know, statistically speaking, but that's it's pretty good. Let's go to the, I think I've got, this is the last one on our end. Yes. Do you know if a large scale project will come to your community, a solar project? So you might have heard whisperings, you might have already met with developers, you know, do you know? A couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you. So most don't know if large-scale solar project will come to your community, and that's pretty consistent to what we're hearing. You really don't know until they appear. And I'm hoping that the solar companies are starting to get into the habit, as Drew said, of meeting with the communities to make sure that you understand what their intentions are, and you can have conversations about it. So that's great. I'm going to stop sharing these results and I'll give the screen back to Drew. Is there a slide after this, Drew?
I just wanted to do a couple closing remarks and then we'll look at some. So what we heard by some of the responses there is that, and I don't want to put Genesee Finger Lakes and Jason on the hook or other county representatives, but I think that's something that that the regional planning agencies can help maybe some of the communities just even identify the fact that whether solar companies will be coming to their community or not. I'm trying to have other counties like Erie County, Niagara County, and other counties and regional entities try to help the local communities, because I have some communities saying we have no idea if these projects are going to come to our community or not. Well, if you'll know by the transmission mains and the transition lines and whatever where they could come. Jason, do you know, does the county have some of that data, or the different agencies have that data?
It's a great question, actually, I love the map that I think you put up that Erie County did, showing those corridors highlighted, and I don't. It's a great question for our 9 member counties, but one of my questions back to you is, I guess, because over the years I've run into some issues with the sensitivity of this data, even though any one of us can sort of drive around and see exactly with our own eyes where the transmission lines are. But it seems that in terms of infrastructure, sometimes agencies get real squirrely with wanting to share the mapping data for whatever reason. So I wasn't sure if you ran across that issue at all with mapping some of this, because
they don't mind the major transmission lines. Again, they're just shown in general areas.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Okay.
They have been sharing that information. That information is shared with the private development community. So I think it should be done. And also be careful too. I've run into this problem where one community looked at their map and saw no transmission mains with transition lines in their community, but didn't look at the adjoining community, which had the transmission line, and they had a big solar project proposed, and half of it extended into the other community. And they said, well, we thought we weren't going to get them because there was no transmission. So you have to look at around your community too. So that's why a more regional approach, and maybe from a regional map, it's not as specific, at least you can see in general. One of my clients actually has a new transmission line being run. There's a transmission line being run from Niagara County down through Erie County. And that new transmission line, if you look at the legislation behind the transition line, it has language in there all about providing access to green energy projects and whatever. I mean, the purpose of that transmission line is to provide access to green energy. And by the way, we haven't brought it up here today, but it's not only wind, it's not only solar, but it's also battery energy storage, guys. Battery energy storage is coming. I did a presentation the other week on battery energy storage. There's going to be, I think the number is in the 5,000 megawatts of battery energy storage has got to be built within the state system in the next 5 years. So you're going to see battery energy storage projects built throughout the communities in these locations also, not just associated with solar or wind projects, just independent battery energy, because we have to store this energy within the system. So there's going to be, and these are larger facilities with different characteristics, and that's for a different presentation, but there are some presentations out there on battery energy storage laws. You probably should put a battery energy storage law together also, not only to address homeowners and businesses who want to do battery energy storage, but also the developer. We've seen it happen. Developers are coming in and putting in half megawatt battery energy storage. It's a money-making adventure. They put them in, they buy power, they sell it back to the grid. It's not even associated with a solar project or wind project. It's just putting in a battery energy storage project. So not to add to more of the things you have to do, but you have to also consider that there's going to be lots of battery energy storage projects. These are lithium-ion batteries is the technology now. So get together with your attorneys and your fire departments and other people to talk about that. And maybe Genesee Finger Lakes can help with that, and other the county agencies with battery storage laws also. That's something else that has to be planned for in the community. So those maps are important. I think those maps are available. You can, hopefully the counties and other regional agencies can help the communities understand where they are, understand a little bit about capacities in those systems, and then also understand what you do have, start to map all those community assets and what community assets, whether they be agricultural lands, et cetera, could be impacted by these properties. So Jason, any questions that we need answering that have come up during our presentation?
Actually, yes, we have a couple. One that I have myself, and I don't know if it's easy to go back to that map of Southern Erie County, but I did notice that there were some areas highlighted in the red dash circles for potential project locations that are not near a transmission line. Care to comment on that at all? Or
Yeah, the larger one on the right side, that's the one I talked about, that they are closer to the transmission line that's in the adjoining town. So that's where that extended into that. The one up in the middle, we're still trying to figure out where they're attaching. It was something talked about. I don't think it's been approved yet or formal application, but we got someone talking about a property up there and we're like, where are they tying into? I mean, that's a pretty long line to run into to connect into the transmission. So again, it's a good start. It may not be real accurate. We're trying to figure that out, why you could have a project proposed up there.
No, that's helpful, because again, the town I worked for in Tompkins County felt like they didn't have much to worry about with large scale installation because they weren't near any transmission lines, but it's not necessarily a foolproof.
It's not foolproof, and it could extend a great distance. I think the line in the next town over is pretty far away, but they centralized the proposal along that area, but then they had to find more and more lands and the project just kept extending out. So they're tied into the system over here, but the project itself just kept getting larger and larger and expanding. I mean, this is a 3,000 acre solar projects. I realize there's now a new one in the state of New York near us. I think Oakfield and Elba has a proposal for 5,000 acres of solar panels. So they can be quite large projects. So other questions?
All right, yeah, and this is a good segue, I think, to Robert's question. Robert LaCourse, I'm going to ask you to unmute and have you ask your question. He was asking about benefits to the town, and I provided some written answers from my perspective in the chat room that you know, this provides a revenue stream for landowners potentially, and can keep their land from being developed into houses and other things. And then depending on the community's priorities, they may wish to support clean energy in a very tangible way by facilitating solar installations, but that's a decision up to the community. But Robert, do you want to expand on that at all for Drew and Leanne?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Drew.
Yep.
We here in the town of Canandaigua have a couple current solar plans coming out. We have many now already, and one is coming across the board already. But the question really is to me is, for me is, what benefit do these eyesores really have to the town members that don't own the land, that have to drive by it every day? And is there any taxes or anything like that garnered from these companies back into the town that would help, I guess, the soreness of all these things alongside the roads coming into our towns?
Right. That's a great question. We hear that all the time at public hearings. Well, what benefit is it to me? You're right. I think Jason said some communities say, hey, we're helping with the green energy issue. But what are the direct impacts to the community? It's not going to produce jobs. Obviously, there's some part-time jobs associated with it. It does have a revenue stream, like we talked about. There is some revenue for the town. I mean, I don't think towns are going out there recruiting solar projects for the revenue stream. There are pilots paid by them. Those pilots have ranged anywhere from $3,000–4,000 a megawatt up to I've seen them up to $10,000–12,000 a megawatt. So if you have the typical 5 megawatt project, you're talking about $20,000 to $50,000 a year in a pilot payment. But again, that pilot payment is split between the county, the school district, and the town. And depending upon your tax structure, the town may only get 10–15% of that monies. That's why we also recommend a host community agreement, because the developers at least understand the fact that they are impacting your community. There are not a lot of tangible benefits. So a host community agreement can help potentially provide you some tangible benefits to your community, something that directly can help with. That's why I have a comprehensive plan that help your community at least get something out of it, something in return for it, because it's hard. It's not. I can't sit there and tell people, oh geez, this is beautiful for the town to have 50 acres or 100 acres or 1,000 acres of solar projects sitting on a piece of land. The theory that the industry used to use, and I told them it does not relate to rural communities a lot. The theory of the industry was they would come in and say, hey, this is a way to preserve agricultural soils, not agricultural operations, but soils, that if you tie this land up for 25 years, you are guaranteed that no one is going to put a subdivision there or growth. Well, in some of the communities, I look at them and say, well, this community has never had a subdivision. They don't build houses. It's not preserving from anything. There's no development pressure. Now, in some communities, it is. If you're preserving those lands long term, I mean, you're going to have to look at solar panels for 25 or 30 years, but long term, theoretically, you're not going to have a subdivision there or something else happen there. But that's one of the industries stopped using that as an explanation. Even Ag and Markets kind of falls back that they said that solar panels are now the permanent conversion of agricultural land. I mean, 20–30 years is a permanent conversion, and people don't think in 30 years from now, we're going to have farming on that piece of property. We're going to have something else. It is kind of a permanent conversion. So it's an excellent question. It's something that we here in the state of New York are going to have to deal with, because 70% of the renewable energy has to come from renewable resources by 2030. And we're seeing a lot of these projects, and it's falling on a lot of local rural communities. I see a lot of articles in the paper about it. And by the way, in the state's budget now, the assessment of solar projects has been taken away from local IDAs. The state of New York now, under the current legislation, has the ability to set the assessment. We don't know where they're going to go with that, but they're going to set the assessment of these solar projects, because they varied so greatly. The state says, look, we're going to set something up. I don't know what the result is that going to be. Maybe some attorney out there has more understanding of where they may go with that. But I talked to NYSERDA the other day, and they have no idea where it's going to go. But they know the legislation has been passed, and someone's going to have to set the value of those projects now. So,
Thanks, Drew.
thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Mike DeBramo in the chat. He's asking about having a requirement that solar projects provide their output to the communities. And Mike, I'm gonna ask you to unmute here as soon as I can find you. But I'm thinking, you know, you're wondering about, you know, providing power from the project directly to the community. And I am no expert on this, Drew. I'm not sure, Leanne, if you have any, but my understanding is that the power goes into the grid and there's no way to designate the electricity created there for a particular community.
Right. Under the, just as an aside, under the 94C regulations, there's been a fund set up that basically one of the funds set up is that if you have a 94C, one of these big projects in your community, that a certain percent, I can't remember the dollar figure, it may be $1,000 or $500 a megawatt, is set aside as a fund to directly help reduce electricity bills in that local community. But as your issue of, if I'm building a 5 megawatt or 100 megawatt or whatever project within the community, you're right, that power gets sold in the grid. They can do, I've seen it offered by large scale solar companies to also build a joint project. That could be part of the host community agreement. We're going to build a community solar project within your community to strictly benefit that community. That can't be part of the main project, but that can be a side project. That's a funding issue, and the attorneys could help a little bit with that and understanding that. So there is some legislation to get at least reductions in electricity bills if you're in that community. We didn't see that as a great impact to some of the communities. We saw it as a few dollars off of the electricity bill, but depending upon the magnitude of the project. But host community agreement, could they build a community solar project for you? That may be something you could say, hey, we want to benefit, we want a community solar project that would directly benefit that community. That's my understanding. If anybody else on the line has more information on that.
And that gets us to a question from Mike Bohan. I think he's asking about actual municipal installation. And I know a little bit about this because, again, the town I worked for installed a solar array on town hall property. And as I understand it, pretty much powered the DPW garage and town hall. So I think that's a little bit different than the, you know, very large scale commercial installations that we've been talking about, but I wasn't sure if you had any insight on that.
By the way, I mean, we're in that business. We'd love to help communities build those projects for their facilities. Those are great. And remember, they run on a net metering thing. Basically, if you do it for your DPW facility or large facility in your community, the solar project generates power. It, you know, net meters, so you reduce your energy bill. You're not typically using the power directly, but you're just net metering to the grid, lowering your power costs for that facility. So those projects can be built. Again, those are typically not the projects people are concerned about, because they could be a couple acre project or an acre project or whatever to service your community. Again, the funding behind those, New York Sun program, is different set of money, so they're usually smaller projects, easier to get monies for and to build those types of projects. The people that are in the private business, they're out there to make money. They're building these 5 megawatt projects. By the way, I didn't bring it up. What's happening now is that we were seeing a lot of single 5 megawatt projects being built on 30 acres of land, and that's because they're funded under the New York Sun program. We're seeing now developers get a piece of property divided into 3 pieces and putting 3 5 megawatt projects on a site, and they still get funded under the New York Sun program because it's a 5 megawatt project. So the community gets a 15 megawatt bigger 120 acre project. So understand that they have been able to figure out how to do those where they're, you know, joint projects. I have 3 of them now, that 3 projects on one property or right on the adjoining property. And we as a municipality are considering it one project. We're not saying it's 3 separate projects, it's one project. The seeker law would say it's one project. It's for looking at the impact of that one project. So interesting turn of events. We're getting only up to 5 megawatts. Now we're getting these joint projects of 3 5 megawatt projects right together on a site. Other questions?
Yeah, we have a question from Jennifer. How are host community agreements introduced? Is it something that has to be mentioned in solar law, or is it project specific?
I've seen developers offer them. Again, we're talking about non-94C. 94C projects are required to have a host community agreement. Typically within that community, they start negotiating those over. When I'm talking about non-94C, someone's coming to your community with a 5 megawatt or a 10 megawatt project. It would be nice to have it referred to in your law. They've offered them in the past, but if your law specifically says we will require a host community agreement, then they will follow your law. I have a bunch of projects that are doing that right now, negotiating a host community agreement because it's in the law. It's a requirement of law. We're not issuing your special use permit till you negotiate that host community agreement. Obviously, there's got to be good communication between the IDA, who's going to be negotiating, if you have a local IDA or the county IDA negotiating a pilot, there's got to be communication between the town and the county that we're doing this through a host community agreement versus a pilot, and then you can have your pilot and whatever. So there's got to be good communication there. And the difference between host community agreements and pilots, and again, talk to your legal counsel on this, is that the money that flows in the communities can be used different ways. You know, a pilot agreement is taxes. It affects your tax cap. It affects all those things. A host community agreement is a fund set up for specific projects to benefit the community. It is money. It can be money, but it's set up a different way. So again, talk to legal counsel. I'm not an expert on that. I'm not giving you legal advice on how to set up funds for host community agreements and pilots and how pilots are handled. But you're right. It would be good to have it in your law, but they have offered in the past without it being the law. That's where we got the idea. Might as well just put it in your law and make it a requirement, because we can't count on the pilots and what structure we're going to get out of the pilots.
All right, speaking of money, Betsy has a question on intervenor funds that are available for municipalities to charge back for their professional consultants.
Right.
Betsy, I'm going to unmute you if you want to follow or add anything to that question.
I think I'm unmuted. Hi, everybody. I was just wondering generally how that's been going. I know that they're doing a little differently under 94C. There aren't that many of these big projects. I'm kind of curious how the money is being used, it's being accessed, and you know, from a practical standpoint, if that's been beneficial.
Excellent question, because we're running into problems with the 94C and the intervenor fund. The difference between Article 10 and 94C is a big difference. For early on in the process, the communities and special interest groups could submit for intervenor funds, and you got intervenor funds early in the process. Bring your professionals on to help you with that. Under 94C, the intervenor funds do not come until a complete application is made to the state of New York. And the issue's been, well, it's all this work ahead of time. We're negotiating host community agreements. We're talking about pilots. We're talking about local impacts. We're talking about zoning. All these developers want to meet with the communities, and there's no intervenor funds available until you get to the actual application, when I believe it's too late. All the work has been done at that point. So what we've been suggesting for the 10th time, work with good legal counsel, is we've been trying to get the applicants to acknowledge that and put a fund in the community to help the community have their experts and attorneys and whatever at their meetings, early on meetings, to get that input early on, because the intervenor funds aren't coming to later on. So all that work is done. So excellent question, Betsy. It is become an issue under 94C because of the time period of when intervenor funds come in.
Thank you.
We have just a few minutes left. I'm going to ask Drew or Leanne to do the poll questions for local government workshop planning purposes, if they could get those going. And I want to give a big thank you to Drew and Leanne and all the folks at Wendell who have worked on this presentation. We really, really appreciate it. We had a great turnout today. I thank everyone for attending.